First off, thank you very much for attending our presentation today. We will be discussing sociolinguistics education of the deaf. So we'll be talking particularly about the experiences of deaf people as they are raised. Now, the panelists are already aware, but so that the participants are all aware, this presentation will be recorded and made publicly available online. I also want to thank the Santa Clara Office of Education for providing this platform for us today. The Office of Education has been helpful in spreading information about deaf and hard of hearing students, so we're very grateful for them. I do also want to note that in the slides that you'll see today, the information provided is evidence-based. Any opinions provided represent those of the presenters and not of the Santa Clara County Office of Education. I also want to briefly, before we get into the subject matter, talk about the range of identities when we talk about deaf people. When we look at the spectrum, you can move from one end where people identify as hard of hearing to coming across the spectrum, we may have those who are hearing impaired. We also then on the other side of the spectrum have those who identify as deaf or culturally deaf, which relates not to an audiological status, but to culture and many number of elements that consist in the identity. Our anticipation is that this presentation will be only an introductory discussion of the material and that we will have following presentations to go further into each of the topics. So let me introduce myself. I am Matthew Domenicini. I teach at Lee High School. I teach math, science, and deaf studies. Today I'll be covering briefly the history of deaf education, what has occurred within the schools, and various transformations that we've had over the past several hundred of years. I will also be providing some statistical information so that you have data on deaf and hard of hearing students. I will then touch upon the least restrictive environment, or LRE, before discussing leadership within deaf education and what that may look like ideally.
I just want to make sure I don't see the interpreter pinned. I don't know if the audience can see the interpreter. Okay, perfect.
Okay, yes, I do see people here on the side of the screen.
Perfect, just making sure. So today, my name's Kelsey Cobb. I'm a teacher for the deaf. I've been teaching for deaf students for 5 years. I've worked in LA, I've moved up here. I'm a middle school teacher. And today we're gonna talk about oralism and manualism, which is a language philosophy spectrum. We're gonna talk about kind of which strategies work the best. And we're gonna learn about 3 different types of DHH programs.
Hello, my name is Norley Hasso, and I am also a DHH teacher with the county. I've been working with the deaf since 1994. That dates me a little. I've done it all: interpreting, aid, working with deaf blind, camps, freelance, everything. And so currently I'm working at Lee High School teaching world history and math and reading. And today I want to take a peek at, again, some evidence-based and factual information of what the demographics of our population and our deaf education staff looks like, and then just kind of how we can bridge some gaps that have been happening over time that I feel like in 2020, there's a giant shift happening to really close those gaps and work toward transforming our programs to better serve our students.
Okay, we're going to give you a little introduction now of the origins of deaf education and some of the literature that we have and research that's been done. Now, in the times of Greco-Roman Empire, we had some information on deaf individuals. However, the wealth of information really began in the 1700s in Europe. We had an abbé by the name of Abbé de la Paix, who was a pastor. He was actually not an ordained minister, but he worked as a minister. He came from a well-to-do family, and one day when he was walking in Paris, he came across a family out in front of their house, and they were not speaking to communicate with each other. Instead, they were using their hands. Well, de la Paix wanted to bring these children to God. He was concerned with their salvation. And his concern was that if these children who were unable to hear did not have this language, they would not be able to come to God. So he thought if he could teach them language and provide vocabulary to them, they would be able to then be saved. They could have a relationship with God. So monies were provided to establish the first school for deaf education in Paris, France. One of the original students of that school was Laurent Clerc. He was a very intelligent child and went through the school and began teaching at the school after he graduated using French Sign Language. Now, simultaneously, while we have these events occurring on the European continent, we have on the American continent a man by the name of Thomas Gallaudet, who interestingly enough was also a minister. Thomas Gallaudet came across a young child who was unable to speak, and he connected with her this very first time through approaching her. She played outside in the yard in the dirt, and he took a stick and wrote the word hat in the dirt. He began to teach this child, and he was impressed with her ability to learn. So when he spoke to her father, who was a well-to-do doctor, they determined that they wanted to move forward in her education. This girl's father sent Gallaudet to Europe. He first went to London, England, to learn about the academic processes for teaching deaf children. While in London, Gallaudet met Clerc, who was there and invited him to return to France with him to see what they were doing in the school. Gallaudet stayed there for 6 months, at which time he was ready to go back to the United States. However, he did not feel prepared to teach and to initiate an educational program. So he asked those who were at the school in Paris to return with him, and Clerc said that he would do so. So the two of them began a 3-month voyage across the ocean, and during this time, they shared their languages with each other. Gallaudet teaching de la Paix French, teaching English, and de la Paix teaching Gallaudet French Sign Language. When they arrived, they established in 1817 the first school for deaf students in the United States. Now we're going to fast forward to the year 1880, where we have the Second International Congress on Education of the Deaf in Paris, France. Excuse me, in Milan, Italy. That was an interpreter error. There were 164 participants at this Milan conference, and only one of them was deaf. Yet the impetus for the conference was to determine what to do within the pedagogy for deaf and hard of hearing students worldwide. There was a vote held to determine if manual communication would continue to be the method for instruction or if oral communication would take place. And the vote came across that oral communication would be supported. With this, we began a worldwide decline of manualism and rise of oralism. We saw this pedagogical approach continue for approximately 100 years until we come to 1970 and a man named William Stokoe, who recognized that American Sign Language was actually a fully functional language. 20 years following that, we began to see the implementation of laws such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, and acts which provides requirements for interpreting and for closed captioning. We also saw another law added that covered FAPE, a free and public education, free appropriate public education. It also focused on LRE and requiring the least restrictive environment for students. Now, before we move forward with any information, I'm going to give you some stats. Annually, we see in this country approximately 9,500 children born who are deaf and hard of hearing. We have approximately 55 born within Santa Clara County. In the county, we have a program that focuses on IDEA Part C, which requires early intervention services be afforded to children. So we have a Chandler Trip program that focuses on early intervention, and we try to get as many infants into the program as possible. However, if you look at the numbers for the Oster Deaf and Hard of Hearing program, we see only 7 students admitted per year, and we have to wonder then what happens to the 33 students who were in the Chandler Trip 0 to 3 program and are not in the continuing program under Otler. So as we look at that, let's look at the least restrictive environment. You'll see a graphic here that talks about the LRE. According to federal law, children are required to be educated in the least restrictive environment possible, somewhere where they have the most access possible. Those in the least restrictive environment, we see many disabled students who are perhaps homebound or unable to attend their schooling. We have individual education plans, IEPs, that are established annually to determine what will be the most appropriate placement for a child, whether that would be anywhere along the spectrum of in the red section where you see those who are homebound, down to the blue section where those who are in the general education setting with no accommodations. So again, when we look at this graphic, you notice that at the top we begin with the most restrictive environment, moving downward to the least restrictive environment. In the red section, we find day schools, those who are doing their education from the hospital, and those who are homebound. We also have, in this state, 2 schools for the deaf, CSD Riverside and CSD Fremont. Those are seen as being more restrictive. They are higher up on this pyramid. We also have some programs where students are able to have a public school setting as well as a special day class where they're able to be in their special ed classrooms. It may be that they have the opportunity to be in their special ed classroom, but have some mainstream opportunities as well. That's where we see in the orange range of the pyramid. The yellow range of the pyramid is where we see things that are more balanced, where students are going back and forth regularly through their gen ed classroom and into their special services. Green is where we see that students are in the gen ed classroom, however, they are provided accommodations such as interpreters or captioning services. Those in the blue section of the pyramid are provided no accommodations whatsoever. Now, when we look at the LRE in relation to deaf and hard of hearing students, deaf people are a linguistic minority. So we have to then ask the question if the LRE pyramid, as typically defined, aligns with our needs and if it aligns with our values. This is definitely a point for further discussion, and if any of you are interested, I would be happy to discuss it with you further at another time. This next slide, you'll see that we're talking about leadership in deaf education. And by leadership here, I'm not restricting only to the principal, but to anyone in this venue who could be seen as a leader, whether that's a principal, an instructor, a paraprofessional, speech language pathologist, or anyone who is there in a leadership role in the schooling setting. Now, we do have evidence showing that we can lead, and we can have leaders who are required to have a knowledge of deaf education and an openness to the goals and the values that we share, and a willingness to hold a shared mission and vision. Another important element of leadership for deaf students is understanding of research and empirical data practices, so that we are ensuring our practices are aligned with and in support of deaf and hard of hearing students' sociolinguistic acquisition. Another important aspect of a leader here is we must have someone who is willing to engage fully and interact personally with students, parents, and others. Here we see that the primary focus does need to be on language and language acquisition.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. I just want to let you know, Matt, that we have a couple people trying to get in, and I just want to make sure the interpreter is pinned, the signing interpreter, not the voicing. All right, perfect. Audience, please let us know if you cannot see the interpreter. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears, and we're going to talk about language philosophies within deaf education. So we're going to start with the spectrum. And on the spectrum, we have oralism on one side, and manualism on the other, and then there's some philosophies that are found in between. Okay, so what is oralism and what is, okay. Matthew, I don't see the interpreter. Now I see the interpreter. Okay, perfect. Oh no. Hold on. Sorry, technical issues. Okay, here we go. So for those who are just now joining us for the interpreter, I'm just going to quickly repeat myself that we are going to take a look at language philosophy spectrum, and it's starting with oralism on one side, manualism on the other, and of course there's some philosophies that are somewhere in between. So what is oralism and what is manualism? So we're going to take a look at the big kind of umbrellas here. Looking at oralism, oralism is pretty simple. What it means is that the person or the educator is a supporter of oral education for deaf people. So what that means is there's an emphasis on speech, on spoken language, on lip reading, on sounding out spoken syllables, and auditory therapy. There is no signing. However, there are some natural gestures that any hearing person would do. It's accepted. And on the other side, we have manualist. So a manualist is just an educator who supports sign language, and Matthew keeps touching my screen, that's okay. Anyways, so a proponent of sign language means they support the manual communication. We have a group of leaders for each movement. So for those of you who are looking at the screen and wondering why the inventor of the telephone has anything to do with deaf education, well, let me tell you. Alexander Graham Bell comes from a family that was involved in deaf education. And his mom actually became deaf later in life, around, I believe, 8 or 10 years old. So she had 8 and 10 years to have full access to spoken English. She could acquire and learn English with ease. And then as her hearing began to go, it became more difficult. There is a loud pinging. Interpreters, can we check to see if that's you? It might be Stephanie. I don't know why there's a pinging. I'm so sorry. Hopefully we can figure that out. And on the other side, there is the manualist movement, those leaders. Matthew already touched on who Laurent Claire is, and Thomas Gallaudet actually had a son. He had many children, and the youngest is Edward. And Edward really took and followed into his father's footsteps and is a huge promoter and advocate for sign language within deaf education. And the pinging has stopped. Thank you very much. Okay, so we look at manualism and we're looking at signing. We throw that word around a lot, signing, we use signing. So what are the two types of signing that we use? Well, we have American Sign Language, which is a natural sign language. It's conceptual, and it is believed to be a solid first language that will help facilitate other language skills, such as reading and writing in English. And the essential goal is that if you learn ASL and you have access and you acquire it, you're going to be able to learn to read and write in English as a second language. And then we have Signing Exact English. This is a sign language with English syntax. The belief that we believe in is that signing in English syntax will enable the child to read and write better. So there's two different beliefs and different approaches. And then there's something in between. It's called SIMCOM, or simultaneous communication. I'm going to keep it very simple for you. It's speaking a language like English and signing at the same time. Something though that we have to be careful with SIMCOM is that its effectiveness is based on your signing skills. So the more proficient you are in sign language, the more effective SIMCOM is. The problem is that for us who are hearing, our natural language is a spoken language. So when we're SIMCOMing, we often lean more towards talking, and we start to drop our signs more, and we don't complete each sign. So SIMCOM can be a little dangerous, but it is effective the more proficient you are in sign language. So taking a look back at manualism, we have sign language and we have manual coded English. So if we take a look at sign language, American Sign Language is the only language recognized by the nation for the deaf community. It's a natural language. It has conceptual meaning. It's complex with grammar. You can express abstract ideas and thoughts. I want you to kind of think about English, French, Spanish, German, Russian, Swahili, all of these languages. I want you to take a look at. Everything that they have, American Sign Language has. American Sign Language is a language. Now looking over at manual coded English, these are 3 types of tools that are used to help support English. So Signing Exact English focuses on the supporting of English syntax, being able to write in English word order. Huge Speech is used for phonics, a way to try to understand and recreate sounds. And then there's the Rochester method. I'm gonna be very transparent. I don't understand the concept or purpose behind it, but what the Rochester method is finger spelling every single word that you say in English word order. Not very effective, but it is something that is out there in our deaf community. So we want to look about, we have all of these ways that we can give language to students. But we want to know kind of what is the most effective. Well, I'm just checking one slide, making sure that was correct. Okay, so we have two factors. We have communication. You need to know which type of communication are we using. Are we doing oral? Are we doing sign only? Are we doing a combination? Are we doing it at the same time? Are we signing first, then speaking, or speaking and then signing? And then also, when was the language acquired or learned? So let's think about it. We've got learning sign from birth or learning oral from birth, spoken language, and learning signs starting from about age 18 months or later. And then we have oral only. So research has found that those students who are deaf, who learn sign from birth, who have access to signing at both their homes and their educational setting, have a significant higher chance of reading and writing in English at par with their hearing peers. A huge significant difference between those who try oral only, or for those who have language delay and don't start to learn or acquire language until the age of 18 months or later. That can mean they didn't start learning sign until 3rd grade or 4th grade, or when they were 2 or when they were 3. There's a huge difference. Something that we want to think about is, how does their language acquisition impact their social emotional well-being? So I want you to think about the most perfect day you've ever had at school or maybe at work. It was perfect. Johnny sat next to me at lunchtime. Sally gave me her apple. I got an A on my test. And you go home, or even at school, and you want to tell your parents, you want to tell your family, you want to tell your teacher or your para, and you can't. You don't have an effective language. There could be many scenarios. Maybe we're signing at school, but we're not signing at home. Or we're signing at home, but parents are broken with their signs. Or it could be that we speak at school and we speak at home, but our home language is different than the language spoken at school. There's many, many factors, but think about the emotional impact that would have, that you can't express what a great day you had. Now take it from the other side. Imagine the worst day you've ever had, and you really just want to tell somebody how you're feeling, and you're not able to do that. Something we have to really take a look at is, what language models are we using at our schools and at home, and what benefits our students? So we've talked about language. Let's talk about the 3 different types of DHH programs that you can find around the nation. So the first one is bilingual, bicultural. There's an oral program and a total communication program. And these are all programs that service deaf children. So bilingual, bicultural, you're going to find these programs at schools for the deaf around the nation. In California, we actually have 3 schools for the deaf. We have California School for the Deaf Riverside, California School for the Deaf Fremont, and then we have Marlton School for the Deaf, a day school, essentially. It's not residential. And at these schools, they really promote American Sign Language and value it to be their first language and accept English as their second. Deaf culture is cultivated, it's fostered, it's cherished, it's valued, it's celebrated through ASL, through students and faculty. Deaf culture and the deaf experience is discussed with deaf children. They get to learn about themselves and other deaf people. And they really promote the identity, to develop their identity as a deaf person within the deaf community and the hearing world through their common language, instead of emphasizing what they lack compared to their hearing peers. Also to note, at bilingual, bicultural programs, they also do support hearing aids. They have audiologists, they have speech therapists, but that's not really highlighted at these programs. Then you have an oral DHH program. You can probably guess what this is. It's an auditory and oral approach. There's no sign language. There's an emphasis on spoken language for communicating and learning. Something to know about oral programs is you're not going to see a K through 12 oral program like you would for a bicultural, bilingual program. The goal of this is that you've worked hard on your auditory and oral skills, that by the time you reach middle school, you're fully included and mainstream into your classes with your peers, and you move on and graduate in high school. Signing is not used. However, natural gestures, again, like I mentioned, anything a hearing person would do is welcomed. And last, we have a total communication program. So total communication, the idea of total communication is to offer all of these things. You could have auditory therapy, speech language, sign language, English language development, all of these things, whatever you need to optimize language development. With total communication, it is a philosophy, not a method. So often what gets confused is that when you hear total communication, you think, oh, if I have to offer sign language and spoken language, that means I must SIMCOM. That's not true. It's not a method, it's a philosophy. A philosophy that believes you should offer all these things to optimize language development. Now, speech, auditory, reading, writing, all of those therapies are supposed to be on an equal platform. Everything is highlighted and emphasized the same and given access to. But I really want us to take a look at what our IEPs look like for total communication programs. You're gonna see a goal for speech. You'll see a goal for audiology services for auditory. You're gonna see goals for English, for reading and writing and English language development. You'll see some self-advocacy goals. But there's one goal that's missing that we don't often see. We don't see any goals that cultivate and track sign language. How are we tracking the acquisition of sign language? How are we monitoring their expressive and receptive skills? We often don't see that. And if we do, it kind of tapers off as they get older in elementary and transfer to middle school. So what started as something that should be equal access kind of turns into a checklist. Okay, we're gonna try speech, we're gonna try auditory therapy, we're gonna try all these things first. And then sometimes what happens is that sign language isn't really emphasized until maybe the combination of the previous things mentioned aren't 100% successful. And then maybe we should emphasize more on sign language, but we have to look at, when does that happen? Is it happening in kindergarten, or is that happening in middle school and high school? So all of these things really have an emphasis on learning English. But we have to remember, the point is to optimize language development, and that should include sign language. And that's all, folks. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is Noralie speaking. Are we switching interpreters? No, okay. So I now know that there are students in our audience, which is wonderful because I feel like we can get some information straight from the source of what we need. So I want all of us to reflect for a few minutes and think about how you identify. How do you identify in your community, your culture, in your social circles? And go ahead and type in either in the chat or in the Q&A, just either words, a sentence, whatever, on how you identify as yourself. Like, who are you, right? How do you identify out in your world? Okay, I'll give you a few minutes. Participation, students. Okay, so how, and then just as you're thinking about that, like maybe name a few things that are important to you, right? What's important to you in your life? One person only wants to share?
Norley, I'm seeing we have people saying hearing, that they're a hearing parent of deaf child. We have deaf members. We have a mom, paraeducator.
A burner.
A burner.
Nice. Burning Man. I know that. Okay. So we have someone who's saying they're the only deaf person in their family. Shout out to Brenna. Okay, a hearing person, a mom, a parent. Okay, any of my students brave enough to share how they identify? We've been doing some of that in class during history.
We have a couple students saying they're deaf. One said he's the only deaf person in his family. These are students.
Okay. And what's important to you in your life? In your community, in your family, in your culture? Being deaf, I see some deaf, black, being a sister. So all of these are all different types of identities. And so we see that there's no one way or one frame of mind or one way to think or to identify, right? We all carry multiple identifications of whoever we are and who we associate, and maybe some of those kind of shift and adjust depending on where we're at or who we're with. So let's see if I have control here. Okay. So now just as educators, you know, those identities that you're thinking about, whether you shared them openly or not, how about those students in your classroom? How do your identities shape who you are as an educator, right? How do your identities in terms of deaf students right now, your identities, how does that shape you as a student, right? Does it impact how you come to school? Does it impact what you do in the classroom? Does it impact how you connect with students, right? And how does that impact us? And if we're struggling to find an answer or to figure out like, oh, I'm not sure about that, then maybe the bigger question is how well do we understand or relate to or validate those student identities or ourselves, our own identities, so that we can bring them safely into the classroom. They can be validated. Everyone can be validated as a whole being with all of the complex identities that we carry. And we have something that we, as an asset instead of a deficit, you know, instead of coming to school and saying, I have to teach this student to do this, and the student says, I have to learn this thing, you know, how are we saying, oh, what do you bring to the table? Right? What does so-and-so have to offer to contribute to the learning of this environment? Okay. So again, we're going to go back to the statistics a little bit. Matthew shared a little bit about that. Kelsey shared a little bit about that. And I think it's important because a lot of times we want to jump ahead to a solution or this wonderful idea without actually acknowledging the history, the complexity of those histories and the impact they've had over time, over, you know, over policies, over standards. You see how Matthew explained, we went from signing to oralism to signing, and finally we're at this intersection of understanding why signing is so important and why it's valued. I mean, even hearing people are capitalizing on that, right? They're selling all these signing videos to hearing babies. However, in the broad scheme of the country's deaf education perspective, we still tend to deny that signing access to babies, right? We focus a lot on the hearing when they're young. And so, you know, it's time for us to kind of join the current movement, if you will. Okay, so here are statistics as of last year of our population as how they identify by race, okay, or by ethnicity, actually, not race. And so you can see just in the big picture of it all, we have 20% who identify as white, and the rest are non-white, if you want to just, you know, put it simple out there. 20% are white, 80% are not white, deaf students, okay? Now let's look at our educator population. Okay, this is California teacher demographics. So these are just the teachers in California. So as you can see, it's basically the opposite, right? So then my question goes back to how are we relating? How are we connecting, right? It's really tough to find statistics on who's hearing and who isn't. But lucky for us, our program is small enough that we could count them within our program. And so this is the statistics we have for our program. So we have a total of 14 teachers. And as you can see, we have one Chicana, that would be me, hi. And one Asian identified teacher, and we are both hearing. And then we have the rest are white. Very few, we have 4 deaf people, 4 deaf educators in our program. 2 are male and 2 are female. So just looking at those demographics and kind of, you know, imagining then, what does our program look like? How do we engage the diversity, the complexity of identities in our program if we have such stark differences as educators compared to our population, our student population? And so I want us to think about that a little bit and marinate on it and try to link as to why the history is important, why the philosophies are important, and why our identities are important in this deaf education program, in all education, right? And so there's clearly a disconnect there in terms of hearing and ethnicity compared to our student population, right? And so the reason we decided to even come today and present is because we see that there's a movement in this country. The NEA, the CTA are moving toward hard and fast, anti-racist, anti-autism. We're moving very quickly to try to establish a little bit more equity, right? To change systems that have been in place for a long time that have been inequitable, where we do a lot of patchwork. We do a lot of, you know, renewing of policies that might allow access for a few more who are at the margins. And so there is this disconnect here just in when we look at the facts, when we look at history, when we look at statistics, when we look at philosophies, we have a disconnect. And not just in our program, all across deaf education, right? And so our offer here today is to invite you to take the opportunity right now in 2020, when there are movements all over and our youth are really pushing us as adults to embrace diversity, to embrace equity, to also embrace that opportunity to learn more, to figure out creative ways to engage our students, to bridge those gaps, right? And there are a ton of models, philosophies, projects, all kinds of stuff that's happening right now that you can embrace to help you in the classroom, to help all of us in the classroom, to center our students, right? I've learned just through experience that when I center my students' experiences and when we all have something to contribute, the content, the curriculum, English, math, history, whatever it is a lot smoother because they're coming because they know, okay, we're learning this together and you value me as a person first. You value me as a human. You understand the complexities of who I am when I come into your classroom. I'm not just an empty vessel that you need to fill, right? Paulo Freire, which I didn't add, and I'm sure is familiar to all of us, you know, he talks about the banking method, how it's not a working method, right? So we want to move deaf education away from that. My colleagues today talked about, you know, the emphasis on language, reading or hearing or writing, and it's a little bit more than that, right? We're people. We want to be, as adults, validated for who we are. We want to be seen. We want to be acknowledged. And so I think that our students would like that too. And it's obvious that we're very different from our student population. And so I invite you then to learn ways of how to center your students' lived experiences, that you take what they bring to the table to incorporate into the learning instead of us viewing of what they're lacking, instead of saying, oh, your writing is not good enough. You know what? You have the most amazing ASL skills and you can explain the most abstract of ideas. Things like that, that really validate and promote student learning. Again, lots of history, lots of statistics, and lots of research out there that shows this. And we as a county are moving toward PBIS, right? So all of these things. And at the very minimum, they also reduce the intentional or unintentional microaggressions that we sometimes say things that we didn't mean. Or in hindsight, oh, that might have been offensive to somebody. And so learning who our students are, understanding all of the different identities that they bring and incorporating those into an asset-based opportunity for learning and co-creating is going to just add to the success of our students, right? And we always look back at, I don't know about you, but I know I can look back at my own school experience and the negative and the positive comes up, right? And it's never about it was an English class or my history class. It was about how the teacher validated me as a person in the classroom and how I contributed or how I was excluded. There's my time. So our closing statements, you know, it's important. Context, identity, history. We have to know where we came from to know why we're here, to know where we're headed. We have to understand our students to be able to connect with them. And this was, like Matthew said, just a very superficial introduction to such a complex dynamic of what is deaf education. And we have an amazing group of deaf educators here in our county who have been, some of us been here forever. And so I feel like now is the time to, you know, connect together. How can we bring in families? How can we connect with our students, right? And we always talk every year about doing family gatherings or doing all of these things, but I don't think we've ever kind of just actually made it happen. But we wanted just to give, if you weren't familiar with deafness at all or deaf education, my internet is unstable. If you are, we invite you to start looking into other methods and models of how to be more asset-based. And just to give you a little bit of help there's community cultural wealth. I encourage you to look into it. I'm not sure if you attended the EL presentation, but there's a whole bunch of resources there. So for me, this was a little bit of building on it and centering a little bit more on deafness rather than just on race and the intersections of all of the different identities, including the LGBTQ communities. But it does take a village for us to improve and build upon the deaf education program we already have. Matthew?
All right, just one moment while I make sure that we have the interpreter as well. Let me just get the button set. Oh, only I am not looking for that interpreter. I am looking for Stephanie. I'm getting a notice though. Are you able to hear the interpreter? Okay, there we go. So we have several questions and comments that have been put in the chat in the Q&A. So we have tried to take care of those as much as we can. We want to thank you very much for coming. And again, as I said at the outset, this presentation is recorded. It will be made available online, so you are free to use it for review or how you need. This presentation also, remember, is based on empirical evidence. It is providing evidence-based information. However, we have also included our own opinions, and the opinions of the presenters are not necessarily representative of the Office of Education. Now, another thing that I'd like you to remember as we close is that when we talk about deaf people, there is a wide range, a large variety of identities amongst deaf people.